And you can always see kids who have started to read who are having trouble simply because their vocabulary is too weak to support the more and more words they are reading. So I remember working in a school with an African-American boy in Pittsburgh, and he read the word pit, and he could sound it out, but you could tell from his eyes that he didn't know what it meant. And so you realize, wow, there's a lot of words he's going to encounter pretty early that he doesn't know what they mean. But he could read, he would just have trouble with the vocabulary, and you had to push the vocabulary along. So I hope I'm being clear in saying I think they're separate modules.
I think you created the distinction about the separate modules. And as stated, I don't have any problem with what you're saying, but I don't know that it's different from what I'm saying.
Okay, so well, that's fine then.
Did you monitor these kids from there on through?
No, I'm afraid we didn't. Okay. It was catch as catch can.
One of the things that, for example, a recent conversation with Tim Shanahan, who is the chairman of the early literacy panel, and was with the National Reading Panel.
Right.
He's been poring over the research. He was originally opposed to the oral language thing. He said it doesn't have that much of a footprint, particularly not in the first grade and kindergarten, second grade.
Right.
But it comes boom in the third grade and fourth grade, right when the kids are hitting the wall.
Right.
Because it's at that point where these early instrumental reading things, which are moving slow and moving simply, don't tax their ability to move, to process fast enough. Doesn't tax their background knowledge to the same degree that the takeoff ramp that's necessary in the third and fourth grade does. So the 3-year-old's vocabulary has a real strong lock on the third grade, fourth grade takeoff in reading, even though it doesn't have a strong correspondence in kindergarten, first grade.
Right. I agree, and I was thinking along the same lines. I also think there's a further reason for all this, which is, remember that vocabulary is really strongly correlated with parental social class. And remember that the parents are doing a lot. And, I have a graduate student, and she's studying in this area, and she also happens to have a 5-year-old boy, and she's been interested in the difference between the reading side and the math side. And we have sort of focused on the reading side. And she said to me the other day, he asked me to teach him some math, and I discovered that he already knows a lot of math. And I asked him, how did you learn that math? She thought that he would want her to help him, like adding 5 and 6. And he said, he's 5 years old. He said, no, that's baby stuff. I want you to help me adding 45 and 36. And she said, well, how did you learn this? Nobody's been teaching you this. And he said, well, I saw Daddy doing something with some numbers, and I asked Daddy about it, and he showed me some of this stuff, and then I started working on it. Well, that kid, when you put him in your data set with the others, is going to be the one who has a higher vocabulary. Now, is that because he's intrinsically brighter? Is that because his parents do a lot more with him, and so on? There's a lot of correlated forces here.
And we come back to it. That's why it has to do with engagement and affect.
Right.
Not per se with... Hart and Risley said, it's about the number of words, but implicit in the number of words is the quality of engagement, and that has, in addition to the kind of pedagogical modeling or the call to inquiry that's going on. It also has an affective dimension to it, and that when the missing ingredient across the entire spectrum here that isn't getting enough attention is the affective dimension. What's happening, just as reading itself is this faster than conscious virtual reality projector system. And the rudiments of mathematics function in a similar way, although because of the nature of mathematics, one of its important distinctions, they're both code systems. They're both artificial code systems. They're technological inventions. But we can volitionally, intentionally, participatively think about mathematics. In order to get to a point where we're past just this crude, simple, beginner, instrumental reading, where we get to a point where reading is transparent. I mean, we can move through it, right? It's got to become faster than conscious, right? It's got to become automatic. So our mind's used to creating these assembled meanings faster than we can be thinking about, than we're aware about. What happens at that level of speed when we develop a feeling level aversion to being confused? Because we feel shame for the confusion. That the confusion evokes a feeling about ourselves that we don't want to have. You ever been ashamed of yourself?
Yeah.
You see how masterful we are at getting out of whatever it is that evokes that? So take that to these autonomic speeds and apply that to what's happening to a child as they're first coming into reading or they're first coming into math. Or first coming into speech. And the imprint that leaves on the very infrastructure of processing and the career that has thereafter.
No, I agree. In fact, within sociology, I think I'm one of the few people who has been interested in that as an equally important, as an equally important feature. So I'm excited that you feel the same way about it.
I do. I think that this is, when I talk to the neuroscientists and the cognitive scientists, they all agree. That's
right. But
that's
you know,
it's, we don't know anything about it.
You know, the trouble is it's very subtle. And we don't fully understand it, and we're not good at measuring it because there's different forms of behavior and there's different sources of behavior. We do have an interest in which part is more manipulable than which other parts. And I think that to get the kind of negative possibilities out on the table also, you've got to deal with the possibility that some kids are brighter, or that brightness, as we understand it, is multidimensional and includes a kind of natural interest and enthusiasm for learning these things, so that some of the behavior that you see may almost be an epiphenomenon. In other words, both the learning, the cognitive progress and the learning-related behaviors are both epiphenomenon of relatively deep-seated features of the person.
Which could come back to, connected what you just said, with a different width of or thickness of threshold of tolerating the frustration and ambiguities and confusions, so that rather than dropping out at this faster than conscious level and disengaging and stuttering the mind from being able to continue the processing, they're able to stay in it longer. Just that. Right. And we're talking about this is talking about 2, 3, 4-year-old children are developing the infrastructure that's regulating that.
Well, and if you're interested in anomalies, which is how science proceeds, you have to realize that here are two that really conflict with one another. On the one hand, an awful lot of our focus has been on cognitive functioning. And, you know, the data always show that nothing predicts itself later like test scores do. So performance is a very solid, real thing. On the other hand, the behavior appears to be important. All of us say it's 98% perspiration and 2% inspiration. And everything, we say that to older people, but it appears that everything is like that. And that makes it sound like it's mostly stick-to-itiveness and focus rather than smartness. So there really is a conflict between the two, and that conflict is not resolved in my mind. It's really a little bit paradoxical.
So the central question for me is, how well do we understand the effect of affect on cognition? And we don't.
I can tell you some negative evidence. Greg Duncan, an economist who you might talk to eventually if you're collecting Heckman-like characters, he's a really nice guy too. He's at Northwestern, really, really good. He's the economist who spends most of his time with psychologists, and he works on just the same stuff we're talking about. And in a paper he wrote, in which he reported the same findings that I had independently found myself, What he points out is that if you get very good measures of cognitive performance and learning-related behaviors in, let's say, first grade, and then you use them both to predict cognitive performance and learning-related behaviors in second grade, you will find that it's mostly cognitive performance predicting itself. And the learning-related behaviors from first grade have a rather small positive effect on cognitive performance in second grade once you allow for the very powerful effect of cognitive performance in first grade.
Which comes back to, it seems to me that's a positive indication of what happens when you, that so long as the child's inside the domain of cognitive performance, meaning that they haven't shamed out, right?
Right.
That they haven't developed an aversion to cognitive failure, to cognitive confusion that's causing them to pull back, so that their learning behaviors aren't. And by the way, this connects with studies that Lyon has done and others, which is we can do whatever we want to boost up social and emotional behavior stuff in children, and they're 3 and 4 years old. It doesn't matter if they hit the wall when they're 6 and 7.
If it's not related to learning, it doesn't transcend domains. It doesn't go across domains.
Right. So how somebody feels fundamentally about their extension into learning is connected to their performance relative to learning, is a shaping all these other things.
Right. And another feature of that is that children are enormously sensitive to the performance of themselves and others, and are very hard-nosed realists about assessing that. And if they tell you, I'm below average in this class, there isn't anything you can tell them that will convince them otherwise.
Whether or not they're
if they say the other kids are smarter, you can't tell them, oh, that's not true.
Well, or what happened with your babysitter.
Right.
That's the first concept, but that's also a shame aversion tactic, is to downgrade or define myself in a way that now mediates against the way I'd feel if I didn't.
Oh, and it was very explicit. I didn't tell you the whole story. He basically said that he would get himself thrown out of class so he didn't have to read in front of the others.
We've got story after story, people breaking their glasses. We have a guy by the name of Richard Lavoie, who is quite famous in the LD circles. With some stories of kids that went through, one kid that couldn't read noticed that another kid couldn't read, but the other kid was deaf. So he said, well, gosh, if I just play deaf, I won't have to read. This kid ended up going through exploratory ear surgery.
6 years
At 6 years old.
Wow, amazing.
The power of shame avoidance. We've been collecting stories about this. It's unbelievable. And it's very connected to what we're talking about here. That's one expression of this shame aversion happening at a gross level rather than this micro time level that's disrupting, stuttering up cognition, feeding back on itself to cancerously negatively affect learning.